what is history? When you look at the way in which the discipline itself, for example, has been conceived, the 19th century there seemed to have been a revolution when historians started to, in the Rankian tradition, where they began talking about history as scientific, history as objective, history as neutral, history that is based itself is based on empiricism and facts and all that. But then from the 19th century to the 20th century to the 80s, we have another tradition which began talking about history as any other narrative, history as story itself, where the unaccounted part of history, of myths and legends and stories, were all brought in, and history became another narrative. So between these two historical moments or historical junctures, where would you place yourself? How do you look at history, Manu?
I think history is that which complicates received wisdom. And I use the word complicates because it's not like complete revision. It's not something that tears everything apart that's come before. But it certainly complicates things and gets us to think better and think and apply our minds when we're thinking about the past. To illustrate with an example, if you think of the temple entry proclamation, since we are sitting in Trivandrum, we all know, if you look at the historical data, this was largely a victory for the Irava community. And it ran for several generations, starting in the late 19th century through the 1920s and 30s, ultimately till 1936, when the final order came from the Raja. It was essentially the Irava community slowly mobilizing, slowly becoming a force, slowly starting to bargain with the state, eventually forcing the state by coming out onto the streets, agitating. And finally, in the 1930s, knowing that the Raja was, very proud of the Hindu nature of the Travancore state, they threatened conversion, and in fact began a process of conversion to other religions. And that's when finally the Raja and his court wakes up, and they decide that, look, something has to be done. The Hindu character of the state has to be preserved. And this is not something radical I'm saying, it's a well established kind of sequence of events. And yet, there are narratives that always try to give a different perspective to this. For instance, Chitradirnal's niece wrote a book, and in that she tells a story about how Srinarayana Guru, before Chitradirnal's birth, prophesied that a great prince was going to be born and he was going to save the Iravas. It's an interesting narrative, right? Which is that the Irava community's decades long agitation suddenly gets neutralized, and it becomes this prophecy destined kind of event where the guru is summoned into the story, and as if he's sort of anointing Chitradirnal as this great savior, and then Chitradirnal comes in and saves the Iravas and keeps them in the Hindu fold and so on. Now, that narrative has certainly circulated in certain areas. The narrative is trying to get rid of the complicated political history and bring the two communities together, saying, look, let's forget the agitation and let's come up with a neat little story as to how this happened. So you have the Irava Guru anointing Chitradirnal as the savior. Now, this is not a historian's job to vettivingify this kind of narrative as it comes. Our job is to question it on the basis of what does the record show, what do the facts suggest, are we looking at all the sources that are available? This is clearly a royalist story, right? But there must be other versions, other perspectives. You put all of that together, and then you have a much more complicated picture of the past. And complicated is not necessarily a word intended in a negative sense. It is a word intended to suggest richness. It is a word intended to suggest layers to history. History is not just one thing. It can be many things all at once, and there is no conundrum in that. There is no tension in that. In that itself, there is a certain kind of beauty to it, and that's why we do history, and that I think is history: to complicate, to question, and to then investigate with an open mind, as opposed to vilifying what you receive from your elders.
Yeah, but even as you say that, there is still that aspect of believing that there is one particular strand waiting to be retrieved or to be brought to the fore. Now, the idea that truth is also something in process, facts are subjective. So between all these things, which are extremely complicated, the task of the historian becomes all the more complicated because there are these subjective truths. There are I don't know whether objective even exists now. You would all vouch for that, because I think everything objective has also a subjective side to it. So between these two poles, it's very, very difficult to think of what kind of fact verification and fact checking you would be doing as far as history is concerned.
That's why the more diverse your sources, the better, right? You take a simple example like in Travancore history, T.K. Velupillai wrote a book called the Travancore State Manual, 1940. That edition. There was an earlier edition, 1906. This is the 1940 edition. Now, it's interesting how even the motives of historical figures change depending on which royalist history you're looking at and from which period. Now, if you take a character like Martanda Varma, soon after his lifetime, there was a Sanskrit play that was written called the Balamartanda Vijaya. Now, the Balamartanda Vijaya, Martanda Varma was a conqueror. He's destroyed lots of Nata Rajyams. He's annexed all their territories. He's seized all their gold, and he's essentially a conqueror. Now, some justification has to be created for this because he upset the earlier order and created a new order. So that was a violent, painful process. Temples were plundered, cities were burned, people were enslaved, people were sold, etc. So you need to now come up with a positive narrative for it. So the Balamartanda Vijaya basically tells us a story where Martanda Varma is this king. He's all ready to renounce the world. He just wants to sort of become a renunciant, a hermetic kind of person. And then just at that juncture, God appears to him, I think in a dream, and God says, no, my temple is in a very bad state. You must now conquer everything up to the Himalayas and bring back the treasure and reconstruct my temple. So Martanda Varma is an unwilling figure in this. He just wants to, it's God who's ordered him to wage war and plunder and bring back everything and reconstruct the temple. Now that is the 18th century narrative. Switch to T.K. Velupillai, and T.K. Velupillai's motivation for Martanda Varma's violence is very different. T.K. Velupillai will say, Martanda Varma did all this because he noticed that European powers were growing stronger and he had a national program or a nationalist program. I forget the exact expression, but he uses the word national. And that is why he conquered all these kingdoms because he realized otherwise the British, etc., would take it. Instead of them, better me he decides to go in and annex all these states. So suddenly the same king, his motivation is interpreted in 1940 by a local historian, by a Darbar historian, no longer as a diktat from God, but as a nationalist thing. Why? Because in the late 30s and 40s, nationalism was the new big thing in India. And they wanted to get onto it, saying that Travancore also had a kind of nationalist program. Now, historian dealing with it is obviously dealing with two subjective perspectives, right? The objective fact is what? Martanda Varma was a figure, he was a king, and he conquered lots of places, and there was a violence involved in it. The subjectivity comes in depending on who's written the story. Now, again, there the job of the historian is not to choose one, but to look at both of these and simply come to the conclusion that at different times, people have interpreted the same historical figure in different ways. Now, obviously, the one that's closest in time to him, we cull it for different kinds of information. T.K. Velupillai, despite his nationalistic sort of claims, he's done a lot of other research and unearthed a lot of other facts which we can draw on, and then ultimately reach a conclusion of our own. Which is not to say that ours is the final definite conclusion either. This is something I always say that 20 years from now, anything I write might be judged by a future generation because they'll have new perspectives by which we will be analyzed, by which our work will be analyzed because we too are creatures of this age. We are also subconsciously perhaps responding to incentives and ideas that exist in our time and therefore shape our thinking and sort of filter how we look upon the past. So all of these are just natural impulses. I think the claim that historians arrived at some objective truth and now this is the certified final version of history, that no longer stands.
No longer
It is. I don't think it ever stood. History is always about revising. It's always about reinterpreting, understanding, analyzing, and that's an ongoing process. Which is why history, in that sense, is ultimately also a conversation or a discussion, or if you prefer, a debate, as opposed to some kind of foregone conclusion that a few people have somehow successfully reached and other people had failed to reach before them.
So, as you speak now, I think we're also moving away from history to a certain sense of a historiography, where you also have, you need to look critically at the way history has been written, how history has been approached at different historical periods, right? So, whose history and all become important there. The logic that you mentioned is there right from Kerolpati, right? The journey to what you believe is modern Kerala and the logic of that journey, all the things that it tries to inscribe. But the question that I think we also need to raise is the idea of history from a very colonial perspective. Keshavan Velathat and others have talked about it, where, say for example, William Logan talking about Kerolpati and the myths and legends of this land as a farrago of legendary nonsense. As a farrago of legendary nonsense. Now, there the question arises, Do myths, do beliefs, do systems, do rituals have no value as far as history is concerned? Are these all farragos of legendary nonsense, or what kind? How do we approach them? The belief systems of a people, what impels them forward with some of the things that they do in their daily lives, with their practices, with their rituals? So I think these are also part of history, and that is something. So the way in which, say, for example, in India, we have conceived of time and we have conceived of our past, and maybe connections with our past are cannot be judged with the same kind of yardsticks that colonial historiography has given us.
It's essentially in the colonial period and from a Western origin that we get the idea of history as a forensic science.
Yeah.
You go into it, you study the details, you study the archives, come up with all the material you can, and then reach a conclusion. And you explain why you reached your certain conclusions. Read anybody's PhD thesis, and that's essentially the process, right? We're all playing by that formula that's come out of the West. You're right that in India, the conception of the past and how we recall the past was slightly different. I think the popular way to sort of divide it, or the easy way to divide it, is between history as we now recognize it, this forensic science where we're trying to understand the past, versus memory, where people are trying to co-opt the past for meaning in the present, which is still happening in our country. That's why we have WhatsApp history. That is why we have people who are twisting history, because for them it's not it doesn't matter what happened in the past. It is how that past can help shape the present that concerns them. And therefore, if you cut and paste on the basis of what you need in the present. If you need Aurangzeb to be a horrible bigoted king right now in the present, then that is what he is. All other shades are completely erased because that is what you need in the present. Whereas the historian will say, no, hold on. Let me just, explain Aurangzeb's position more fully, not to support him, not to justify him, but let me just put him in perspective. So there is a kind of tension there. Which is not to say that the Farrago of legendary nonsense school of thinking is valid either, because again, in a society built on orality, on oral culture, where even the Vedas were originally an oral tradition before they were written down only about 1,000 years ago. 2,000, 3,000 years before that, it moved around as an oral tradition. All of our culture is, in that sense, recorded in oral histories. It is through orality that these stories have come down to us, and that definitely has value. Even if it is not always exact, even if it is not always done in a forensic fashion, it is still reflecting what different people at different times wanted the world to know of them. In Kerala, my favorite story to sort of illustrate this is the Chairman Perumal story. King is, he disappears, goes off to Mecca, becomes a Muslim, and then divides his kingdom here among his family members. All the Hindu royals in Kerala claimed their right to rule from that division of Chairman Perumal. So Venat is supposed to be Chairman Perumal's son. Kochi Raja is supposed to be Chairman Perumal's nephew. And there's a caste thing also in that, where Kochi is higher and Tiruthankur is lower. So all of that is happening because they all trace their origins back to that legendary figure and sort of say that, look, this is why we are here as kings. At the same time, the Chairman Perumal legend later gets a few added sort of brushstrokes. In one later variant, we hear that, look, he was standing on his balcony and he saw the moon being split. And that was the Prophet Muhammad splitting the moon, the famous miracle. And he says, oh my God, this is so remarkable. I need to know what's happening. And that's how he essentially converts to Islam and goes off. Now, the thing is, this in a way is also creating room for Islam to be accepted into local society. Right? It's creating a narrative space where Chairman Perumal, witnessing the Prophet splitting the moon and then going off to become a Muslim, is creating a kind of elite position for Islam to be absorbed into local society as well. So it is myth. If you look at it just from the perspective of myth, you'll say, yeah, this is a rubbishy story. It doesn't make sense to me. Chairman Perumal standing on his balcony conveniently just when the Prophet is doing the miracle. Was there even such a person? People ask all these questions, and understandably so. But the stories are trying to communicate something. They're trying to create a certain kind of conversation around them, and they're trying to reflect something to us in the future. And I think therefore, we do not dismiss myths or the subjective, accounts either, simply because they do hold something of meaning. Another oral example you can take is, since we spoke about the Idva community earlier, Sri Narayana Guru. Now, he died of illness. It's not entirely clear whether it was tuberculosis. I heard today, we were just talking earlier, that might have been throat cancer. But that's how he died. It was illness, age. He had reached a certain age. Now, it's funny that among these oral traditions that go around, I remember hearing a story which was from a so-called Nayar circle. And you know the tension between the Nayars and the Iravas. And this oral account basically said Sri Narayana Guru had prophesied that he was going to die on day XYZ. The day came and it was evening and he had still not died. So finally, his disciples picked up a tenga or a rock or something and beat him to death. Now, this is obviously created to denigrate. This is obviously created to suggest that Srinarayana Guru was some kind of a charlatan. It's obviously Nayars venting their resentment towards an Edava public figure and a spiritual leader. Now, in and of itself, the story is, as people giggled here just now, it is improbable. But the existence of the story is evidence for a historian to understand how the Nayars looked at the Edavas and looked at Srinarayana Guru. On the Edava side, I remember when I was doing my book on Travancore, Setu Lakshmi Bai of Travancore, I remember hearing a story about how he lived in Varkala and the Rani was also in Varkala, and apparently she wanted to see him. And she sent a card to the Guru's house saying, "Come, please come and have tea with me." And Guru said, "No, I will not go to see the queen." But all the same, he also still wanted to give her a darshan. So one fine morning, he decides to take a walk on the beach outside her palace. And the Rani sees him from her window. And the story goes that she runs up the hill towards the cliffs, shouting, "Guruve, Guruve." Now, the thing is, if you've studied Setu Lakshmi Bai's life, she's not the type of person to get out and run up a hill shouting, "Guruve, Guruve." But the point is, again, the story is trying to communicate from the Edava perspective that the Guru was such a respected figure that even the Rani of Travancore wanted a darshan but could not get it and was reduced to running up a hill, shouting his name like a fangirl of sorts. That again is historical material because it's not the exact truth, it's not an accurate account of something that happened on a specific date, but it is a story that is trying to communicate something to you about the Guru's greatness and about his personality and his appeal even before kings and even before queens. So again, we therefore as historians must be open to the possibilities of finding material in the most awkward of places, in the most surprising of places, in buildings, in art, in these kind of funny stories that circulate, simply because all of these stories seem to exist for a reason. Not because, they're just stories that somebody devised for their own amusement. That's not really what's happening here. These are reflective of certain social impulses, and we should learn to interpret them and therefore bring them on board and understand the past better that way.
I think it's a very relevant point that you have raised. But talking about the ideological nature of narratives of history, for example, is sometimes very difficult. Nellum Padirum, how do you separate? Sometimes the kind of facts that, they might not be even readily available. It might just be the story floating around. So the ideological nature of history itself is so problematic especially when there is the absence of archives. So this is again a question that I have raised with you earlier. But where do you look for archives? What kind of archives do you depend upon when there are these stories that just told us now? So how do you approach them from the historian's perspective, and what kind of archives do you look at?
So the archive is not a physical space necessarily where there are things kept and documents kept and you go and look at them almost under a microscope and study them with your laptop and your other things. An archive could be all kinds of things. It could be the songs that peasants sang in the fields when they were working. That is an archive because often, especially with Dalit communities, a lot of their heroes, a lot of their public figures, most of whom are lost now to us because nobody's codified a lot of this, that is often recorded in song. Sometimes, as I was saying, it could be paintings, it could be pictures, because how kings want to fashion themselves versus how they actually might be in real life, there's a difference. So in a Ravi Verma painting, you might get a very different image of a king, but that is the image the king wants to project vis-a-vis something else. It's the same with photographs. You look at studies of the famous photographer Raja Deen Dayal. There was a lot of thought put into how people were sat down, how they were framed, how they would look into the camera or look away from the camera and so on, because all of this was ways of self-fashioning. Now that collection of photographs is also an archive. In fact, there's a whole study done on Ram Singh of Jaipur, who was this Raja. He was a bit of a camera maniac. He went and photographed all the women in his harem. And often we think of the harem as this very secluded space and the women are sort of trapped inside and all of that. But the women you see in the photographs are very different. They look firstly very normal. They're dressed in interesting ways, of course, very different in diverse ways. But a lot of them have personality to their faces, the body language, the way they're sitting and so on. More importantly, of course, this is not known to many scholars, but I have seen the original, the picture, where the Raja also took naughty pictures of him with some of his female lovers. And that also tells you something about him, right? That is also an archive. The Raja of Jaipur, this great Rajput warrior. Well, I've got a naughty picture of you with a lady. It is a source of information. It gives you a brief insight into his mind, over and above him as a king, you suddenly see a more human side of this person in such a photograph. So there's that kind of archive. Then there's of course the kind of stories that circulate in our own households. You know, a lot of history is not just the facts and figures. There's an emotional texture and an emotional breadth to history as well. And that you don't need to travel too far in time or too far from home to find. Sometimes you just speak to your own family members and you discover that you can understand the world through some of their own challenges. My mother, she grew up in Delhi originally, then she moved to Kerala. She wanted to start either go into sports because she was very good at that, or she wanted to sing. And her mother allowed her to do neither. Her mother said, if you go into sports, you'll end up looking like a man, so not happening. And part of it is all not acceptable. ഈ സിനിമ ലോകത്തിലെ ആൾക്കാരൊക്കെ വലിയ ആഭാസന്മാരാണ്, അതുകൊണ്ട് വേണ്ട. So that was also put aside. So her choice got circumscribed there. Now, that obviously determined every other subsequent decision she took in life, because what she wanted to do, she could never do because she was born as a girl. If she was a son, she might have had greater freedom, but as a girl, she did not have that freedom. The irony is, if I go to her mother's generation, my grandmother, who prevented her from studying, this is a woman, and I think we discussed that at the earlier session also, where she basically had my mother realize that pregnancy is a very painful process, and she told my grandfather, I don't want more children. This is not happening. Find birth control or some process, but no more children. And my grandfather accepted. At that time, if you look at it in the 60s, a woman telling her husband, look, no more children, deal with it. That is, in a sense, a feminist kind of language that she's speaking. And yet, when it came to her own daughter, there was a flip. She wouldn't allow her daughter any kind of freedom. This is not to blame anyone or anything, but through just the stories of these two women, individual stories, just barely one or two stories, I'm understanding that not only their words, but also what is denied to them. Not just in a textbook, not just in some kind of abstracted information, but in its whole emotional sort of complete form, because it is directly in our houses. We all think of our grandparents and parents as parents, grandparents. They were human beings, they were individuals. Think of a 20-year-old girl in an arranged marriage or 19-year-old girl in an arranged marriage, meeting the man she's marrying for the first time at the wedding mandapam. And she's to go that evening and share a bed with him. It would have been traumatizing for many women. Nobody prepares you for these things. When I was doing my Travancore book, the Maharani of Travancore, when her daughter gets married, told her daughter, this was sex education. He's going to do certain things, just don't bother. Just, lie there and bear it. That is what essentially was given as sex education. The men were given slightly better training. They were taken to the priest of the royal family called Kakataboti, and Kakataboti would tell them what they could and could not do with the princess of Travancore. These individual stories, they have a certain kind of human quality to them. That is also an archive. The oral historians like Achal Malhotra, the way they've studied partition is not through disembodied numbers and facts and statistics of how many people left and how many people came. She looks at objects. When you leave your house and you're running away with your life, what are the things you take with you? Many people thought that they were going to go back and collect all their goods later, so they just locked the houses and went off with the keys. They never went back. And for them, that key, that set of keys has now become a representative of that entire, memory of what they've lost or what they had to give up and then come here. Some people brought with them just a lota, like a little mug or whatever. That mug, if I were to walk into a room and look at that mug, it would just look like any other object. But to them, that mug signifies that final link with what used to be their home. That is also an archive. So the archives are not necessarily what we generally think of as a place with dusty files. Archives are endless in terms of where we are looking, what we are looking for, what kinds of stories we're looking to tell. If you're doing biographies, you're going to find that as you go up and down the social ladder, the kind of material you're dealing with changes. I was reading a book by Sudhir Chandra of Rukmabai. Rukmabai was this Maharashtrian lady from the Sutar community, which is it's not a lower caste Avarna community, but I think it's on the lower side of things. She's one of the first women who went on to become a doctor after going and studying abroad. But she was more famous because she was married as a child to a man. And then when she grew up a little bit, she objected to the union and she refused to go with her husband. She said, I'd rather go to jail, but I'm not going to go with this man to whom I was married as a child of 10 years old. And this became a big court case and all of that. And he, right at the beginning of the book, notes the great challenges in trying to unearth her story, because outside of the court case, there aren't that many sources. Her family has only these glorifying sources where she's this wonderful person, that's a great ancestor to be proud of. But no letters, no diaries, no written records of her own, except for a brief part of her life. So how do you flesh out a person like that? My challenge with Setu Lakshmi Bai was very different. Surplus of material, lots of official records, lots of files, lots of documents, and yet nothing that really gives me a window into her thinking. So the challenge is therefore in the archive also depends on what story you're telling, what you're looking for, and therefore you sort of figure your archive accordingly.
Now you understand how difficult my job is. You ask something to Manu and he's like Pashun Kairum ellam kondu povum. And I mean, how do I ask him to stop somewhere because there are questions coming up along those lines. But something that you mentioned is very interesting, Manu. Talked about memories, right? There is a mnemonic history. But then that mnemonic history that you're talking about, when it comes to rajas or when it comes to ranis or sultans, it's fine. But what about the histories of you and me? What about ordinary people? You know, the way we record our experiences, our emotions. These subjective histories of 2020, for example, our own lived experiences, the fragrances, the smells, the touch. You know, these are also, in a sense, a record of a time that we spent here, the here and the now of a particular historical epoch. Say, for example, 99 വെള്ളപ്പൊക്കം, right? There are all these official documents about this great flood of, that we all talk about, our grandparents talk about. But my great grandmother, for example, she used to say, 99 വെള്ളപ്പൊക്കത്തിലാണ് അയ്യപ്പൻകുട്ടി ഉണ്ടായത്. That is,
We've got the same thing in our
right? So for her, that memories of my great grandfather coming up in the flood, you know, നീന്തി തുഴഞ്ഞ് കയറി വന്ന് and whatever, you know. So, and then her conceiving her first child is linked to that great flood it's a very, very affective kind of a linkage with a phenomenon that maybe upset the entire the pulse of a land. But then for her it's a different kind of a memory. So these mnemonic kinds of histories and the ordinary individual experiences of people, ordinary people, not the kings and the queens. So how do we approach them as a historian? And I'll raise that question later, but how do we approach this?
I think the challenge is often in finding this, because again we are so conditioned to think about history a certain way and look only for certain kinds of stories that we don't necessarily always take up the challenge of finding these slightly more difficult, slightly more fluid, less easy to grasp kind of histories. Everyday histories are very tough to put together. You know, how even if you're doing, say, an oral archive, you're collecting material, how many people are you going to interview? Humanly, how much is possible? Is there a geographical limit, and therefore is there a limitation to what you're trying to do? What may be true in North Kerala may not be true in South Kerala. Memory of a cultural event in Kochi may be very different from that in Trivandrum. The dialects change, the way people think sometimes change. Caste attitudes in some places may vary. One example I gave is, the Madar community, temple drummers. Kochilum, South Malabar loke poya, they're called Madars and they're treated higher than the Nayars. You come to South Kerala, you don't even hear the surname. They are there, but they're called Panikkar and Kurpa, which are basically like Nayar surnames, and they're treated as inferior to Nayars. The same caste's position in the caste category has moved depending on where in Kerala you're standing. So I think there is a challenge in sometimes getting these stories, because sometimes they're very sort of mixed up, they're very difficult to unearth. Sometimes you face problems like the famous Nangeli story, right?
I was just going to mention that.
Most people know the Nangeli story as the Irava lady who cuts off her breasts. But there is an exact parallel in a tribal case, I think in Poonya or Pandalam or one of those places, where it's a tribal woman who cuts off her breasts, and we don't even have a name for it, but this is recorded and written down and so on. Now, which makes you think, right? Which of these is the original story? Is there an original story? Or is it something that happened at some point? And as a template, was it seized upon to mark resistance by various communities? Why are we assuming that was only one place? Maybe it became a form of marking dissent, which different people at different times appropriated, and even if it did not physically happen, they appropriated the story to mark their dissent and tell that, we also object to this. So I think that's another thing. This next story I should not really tell, because I got trolled for this recently, or when it came out as a stupid reel on Instagram. But I think it matters, because pande this todal tindal, all of that, all galatha, my great grandmother's time, 1930s and so, there was this thing where the adiyamare who worked on the fields, they could not come near the house, they could not look at members of the family directly, they could not address them by name.
I'm thinking I'm also going to get trolled along with you for this.
That's okay. I mean, you're also Pillai, I'm also Pillai, you get trolled for our surnames also, so it's
somebody
inevitable.
asked us idanda Pillamarude samsthana sammelanam.
So that was the rule, that you're not supposed to, they were not supposed to address them and so on. Appan per edukkan paadilla. And the story goes that my great grandmother at one point, her name was Kalyani, she heard her name being loudly sort of called out from somewhere. And then she comes out and she sort of inquires, who's saying my name like that? She's supposedly this Tarawatama type person, and nobody's supposed to utter her name like that. And then she discovers that all the cattle that the field workers have and they are using in the fields have been named after members of our family. So Anatha Kalyani under Madhavan under my great grandfather's name was Madhavan. So all their names had been appropriated for the cattle, and the ostensible thing was cattle. Cattle is an agrarian economy. Cattle is sutta. Therefore, it is not an insult. It is meant to be a kind of thing. But what is it actually doing?
It's a brilliant act of subversion.
It is a brilliant act of subversion. I don't know why I got trolled, because just as everybody here laughed, I laughed when I relate the story, and people felt that I should not have laughed, that I was somehow, belittling them. But I wasn't, because the humor is used here as a weapon against my ancestor. We're laughing at her, not at them. She's the butt of the joke. She's the one they're lampooning, and she's the one who, therefore, is at the receiving end of this whole dynamic. So that's a literal story from my village that happened to trickle down to me. In many cases, we've lost most such stories. You look at even the gods that were worshipped. There were so many tribal kind of gods in groves. Depending on, again, where you stand on the caste ladder, there were different types of gods you worship. You'll have some kind of, art in it with the chora and the liquor and all of that. Many people are now ashamed about these things. So people have forgotten gods even. There are gods who've been abandoned. There are gods and groves that no longer receive any puja, or they've been Brahmanized and sort of transformed completely.
I think that's a very important point. The Bowdlerization of history, if I can call it that. The way we have tried to sweep certain things that do not fit the exigencies of our age and our ideological imperatives under the carpet and pretend that it was something else. I think that is something that we need to address, because it is also creating a past or maybe erasing a past. It's like Bollywood. There is no caste in Indian cinema, right? It's like caste is very effectively neutralized as far as Bollywood or any popular cinema for that matter is concerned. So the way in which history is bowdlerized, his history is maybe corrected and swept under the carpet. I think that is again something that we will need to look at, very, very specific ideological imperatives of the age in which this happens. Say, for example, the nationalist movement and the way it gets narrated in different parts of the country in different ways, right?
Yeah. I mean, the nationalist movement wasn't one movement to start with, right? The same movement at different junctures has very different orientations. It begins as a very elite, moral kind of argument in the English language by English educated people. So much so that the Congress Party's first meeting, they say that you must speak the English language if you want to attend, because otherwise you can't participate. From there, it slowly becomes something bigger. There is a kind of firebrand energy that comes in with the Tilak generation a few years later. Gandhiji comes and turns it into a mass movement, but in the process, he also injects religion into it. And that's one of the famous, moments where Jinnah basically walks out of the Congress saying, this is becoming religious. It's becoming a Hinduized movement as opposed to a nationalist movement and so on. So Gandhiji himself, therefore, offers us not just one personality, but a kind of, a series of faces at different moments. When he's a younger man, he says some racist things when he's living in Africa. Then when he's an older man, he regrets some of the racist things he says. We have that famous story about how at the age of 36 or 38 or whatever it was, he decides to become celibate. And I always found it very puzzling, because I thought, did anyone ask his wife? Did he ask his wife? Did she want to go celibate, or was this imposed on her? So we often think that, oh, look at him, he's becoming a saint, right? It's a moment where he transitions from an ordinary man into almost divine status, because he gives up even sex and other things and becomes this sort of all self-denying kind of character. But there was a set of people around him who were dependent on him. And I'm not saying this to blame him or say it was bad or good or anything. It's just interesting questions as to whether Kasturba Gandhi was consulted, whether she had an opinion, how did she deal with it. Gandhiji wanted to clean toilets, but he also made his wife clean toilets. And that he did against her will. So you have a husband asserting a certain kind of power on his wife and making her do something she doesn't want to do.
Actually,
which is also a bit it's a bit, uncomfortable.
Madhavikutty is a very interesting story. I don't remember I think it's titled Palakya Mala. Gandhi comes to Kerala, and the women of the area, they actually donate all their ornaments to Gandhiji. But then, one of these women, she's in the last lap of her life, and she's in a semi-conscious state, and she keeps on uttering Enda Palakya Mala, because there is a certain kind of a bond that she had with what she sacrificed for Gandhi, which she is not able to get over. And that is a different kind of a history that she's trying to talk about. But leaving all that aside, I'm also thinking about subaltern histories, histories of people who did not have languages, histories of people whose tales have not been in any sense recorded. Uh, these subaltern histories need not always be about resistance, they might also be about subjugation. So how do we look at those histories is a question that always, I think, haunts historians.
And
Right?
sadly, I don't think we have a very compelling answer for it, simply because, as you said, the material itself offers such challenges. Often, even if they themselves have not recorded their history, say in the colonial period, because the colonizing state was very keen to understand the Indian people, they'd go into all kinds of places, create these state manuals and census reports and all of that. And community by community, they would sort of paraphrase and collect information. But again, it's their version of what they think the story is. The story may not be very different as the way people relate it, but it's been put down in writing by the colonizing power or the colonizing state in a certain way, and we are now dependent on that as opposed to the original substance, because the original substance has also vanished now. So then, what do you do in a situation like this? Sadly, there is no easy answer to it. You make the most of what you have, and with things that have still not perished, you try and do your best to sort of put down those stories and understand those stories. There's a wonderful book by Divya Cherian. It's on Marwar in Rajasthan. It's one of these Rajput states. And it's one of these, it's a remarkable book because it tells us a lot about caste as well as religious identity, where she shows how in the 18th century, and she's gone into the Marwar records in the local language and studied this particular place. And you find that the state has now taken on, firstly, vegetarianism. They've decided that people have to be vegetarian, and they've issued diktats to people saying now all of you must be vegetarian. If these castes must all become vegetarian, etc., etc. Gods and temples. Till if yesterday barbers and other relatively lower level communities could come into the temple, or right outside the main sanctum of the temple, suddenly they're told you can't enter anymore. You've had to go back. There are stories of resistance also, but more often than not, we have only the diktats of the state and what the state is trying to do, as opposed to a voice of the people and how they are trying to respond to this as well. There are responses, but there aren't enough responses. I think we're trying to, we always face that problem in India.
I think in material evidences that you spoke about earlier, the material archives, this is also equally applicable, because say for example photographs, the framing devices, the camera angle, the lighting, it's a very ethnographic colonial kind of a gaze upon which the camera also operates. Same for painting also.
Your book has that also, no? In
Yeah.
fact, in the book that we just released in the afternoon, there is an essay which talks about Ravi Varma's paintings of women and how the women are presented in that.
Yeah. Now, it's a little tricky question. A history that is badly told will not have much of an audience, right? Much of readership.
Well, I don't know. Ashwati Tirunal Gauri Lakshmi Bai wrote a history which has some audience clearly.
So there is the art of telling history, right? So is history an art or a science? Is a question that has haunted historians.
I don't think it needs to be an or. I think it can be both. There is a certain, there is a scientific approach, and the way you approach the past needs to have a certain scientific side of your brain activated, because you're not going in there purely to tell a story. You're first trying to understand what happened and then frame it into a narrative that communicates the complexity of the subject. But at the same time, it is also an art, increasingly so, because people are so interested in history now. History is always being co-opted for political purposes, that how you communicate that history is becoming more and more important. And I think there is the element of art that comes in there. How you're presenting it, how you're digesting the material, who you're telling the story to. All of these factors play into how ultimately it translates from your mind and from the data you've gathered into the actual page that is printed and goes out into the world. So I don't think it's an or, it's more of an and situation. And once if you're able to tap both of those, nothing like it. Because I think in some ways, originally, or even in the West, although history evolved there as this forensic science, it was also considered a great kind of literary writing. Writing history was seen as an act of literature, because you're also, investing in telling the story a certain way. And we don't necessarily need to be swayed by ideological kind of positions, but at the same time, investing in telling history well, I think clarifies it for a lot more people and prevents confusion where larger numbers of people are concerned.
But when we say, for example, Paul Ricoeur and others, that history, for example, is just another kind of a narrative, like any other narrative, history is a narrative. Is that diluting the issue too much?
I mean, I wouldn't really pick a bone with him because historians aren't special. We come to the same material, we come to the same aspects of the past from one perspective. Sociologists do it in a different way, anthropologists do it in a different way. But what I do find is now these things are increasingly overlapping, right?
Yeah.
When you do a book, you're no longer doing it from a purist historian's perspective. You're, in a sense, bringing in the sociology. You're bringing in feminist theory. You're bringing in anthropological evidence. You're bringing in all kinds of material. And it's the interplay of all of this that gives you something that is a fairly, good, well done kind of account of the past. So I think in that sense, we, I think, have therefore moved ahead from, this position and this whole issue, but because we've now expanded our lens, we've expanded our horizons a little bit.
A question that probably some of the students might want to ask, which has also been nagging me for some time, the disciplinization of history. History as a discipline, the way it is taught in our academia. Do you have any grouse with it, Manu?
Not really. I mean, then one would have a grouse with lots of things in life, right? Sometimes things are just the way they are. We have to. The thing is, a teacher is not going to teach you, or a department is not going to teach you how to do history well in your distinct style. It will equip you with certain tools about how to think about history, how to approach evidence, how to digest and process all the data. But then you're on your own in a way, right? Each of us, we bring something distinct from our own subjective experiences to the training, and then we write our books. It's not as if we are all, it's not like history departments are factories that are producing the same kinds of historians, right? They're equipping us with similar tools so that the ground rules are clear. But what we do with those ground rules is up to each of us. So I don't think I have too many issues with that. I think so long as the training is done openly, it is done with in a clear sort of fashion, people come out clear-headed about how they must look at the past, then it's fine. Then it's up to them, and it's up to each person and scholar as to how they deal with it. And we all have our individual subjective interests. So we anyway take those tools we get in formal training and then apply it to very different subjects. So the end result is naturally going to be diverse and therefore different, and sometimes of different quality as well. In the life of the same writer, the same scholar, certain books will be of a higher standard than certain other books. It's only a natural process because we are also human beings, ultimately dealing in a human world with various limitations.
One final question before I open it up to you. I've heard people call you a popular historian. Does that rankle you?
Not
Because
really.
what is this popular historian and historian?
I think the idea of popular history, and this is again a Western kind of jargon that we've imported, where the idea of a popular historian is somebody who writes for the larger audience, whereas the serious historian, the academic historian, writes basically for other scholars, for peers, right? So, you get the sense of it. So when I did my PhD thesis, I didn't invest very much in language in that because I could use the jargon because I knew the people who were going to read the dissertation were part of the same world. So I could use a certain kind of vocabulary without any stress there because I knew who was going to read it. But when I'm writing for a much bigger audience, the kind of, your brain works in a different way because you're trying to make complex ideas accessible. You're not making it simplistic, but you are making it simpler. There's a difference between simple and simplistic. And you're sort of, trying to sort of walk that tightrope. So I think that's the difference. It doesn't rankle me at a level of ego or anything. I have a PhD. My books have been endorsed by some of the biggest historians in the field, who are all academic historians, because I think a lot of them are older historians, and I think they also recognize in today's world the need for accessible history. In the West, scholars have bridged this gap long ago. One example that I typically give is Mary Beard. She teaches at a university, a top 10 university in the world. She's an accredited scholar. But at the same time, she regularly publishes for a popular audience because she doesn't want to keep that purely in the seminar circuit. She wants the research she does to go out into the world and be part of a broader conversation. So I think, yeah, it's a thing. People sometimes have ego issues around it, and it's like a competition of sorts. But again, who cares?
What was your PhD topic on?
It was Tirudhamkur again. So my book was about 20th century for most part. Setu Lakshmibai, Setu Parvathibai, that period. This was a century before. It's when the East India companies just come in and the sort of consequences with power structures here in Travancore state at that time. There's a deity, there's a succession thing, there are political institutions here, there's the temple, and there's the East India Company, which has its own political motivations, and how these sort of clash and then reshape the way, the Travancore state evolves after that.
Thank you so much. I'm sure that there are questions from the audience. Shall we take a few? Yeah.
History has been concocted in such a way that it suits certain political dispensation. You told about history being viewed in different angles, in different ways, and learning about history in other ways. But look into the young generation that is coming in. They are being treated with a history that is so concordant, so diverse, so much of far away from the truth, or maybe towards the truth. No one knows, but apparently does not the truth suffers, and the new generation who are coming up is running a history which is far from the truth and far from the reality. How do you evaluate it? And is there no risk in it?
I think it's not a crisis of history alone, it's a crisis of general like education of kids. We don't educate kids to think. We don't educate kids to apply their minds. We educate them to pass exams, and then we even inevitably when they're faced with complex things, they succumb to whatever is the easiest narrative, or whatever seems to be emotionally the most appealing narrative at a certain moment. So I don't think one answer, of course, is making history more accessible, good history, well-researched history. It doesn't have to all be in agreement or be part of one ideological stable. It can still be diverse. It can still be, very, very heavily debated, but it can be done well. That much can be done. But I think the broader answer is teaching people to think and apply their minds so that then they don't fall for it. I mentioned the book by Gauri Lakshmi Bai. My issue with that book was quite simple, which is that if you read that book, there's a whole royalist crowd in Trivandrum who've gone gaga over the book and so on. But it's interesting, if you look at the main source material for the book, it was just one source. My grandmother told me so. Now, most people, like I get messages on Instagram, etc., saying, what is your response to this book? And I don't respond to most of these, but in my head, I'm like, it should be clear to you, because if you look at the sources for the story, it should automatically be clear to you what is a better sort of history and what is Granny Says So. There's a kind of difference in that. There is a moment in that book where the Raja's grandmother is dying, and she has this sort of this very strange experience where extraterrestrials come and tie her legs and drag her away to wherever she's supposed to go after death. She doesn't go. And in the book, which is fine, this may be a strange dream Granny had, who knows? It's fine. That much is okay. But then the next line in that paragraph says, and the rope marks on her feet were seen by one of the cousins of the Raja. That's when I rolled my eyes and I was like, really? Extraterrestrials? Normally in like American movies, they land in America. But here they came to Tiruthamkur, went to the palace, got hold of the Raja's grandmother and tried to drag her to wherever she wanted to go. And that is where you have to apply your mind. I should not need to say this. When you see that in a history book, extraterrestrials leaving marks on an old lady's feet, that should itself automatically give people pause and think, hold on, am I reading a history book or am I reading something else? But that, I think, people are not yet entirely able to do. Partly because our education system isn't devised to do that. And by the time a lot of kids do this, it is in the humanities departments in college, at college level. And what happens is most kids who in our country go after engineering or medicine or the scientific sort of line, they have no exposure to humanities afterwards. So even on something as simple as reservations, for example, you'll find all these like big IIT bros on Twitter lecturing about how less reservations need to go and things like that, because their perspective of the world is a very technocratic, efficient kind of model, not realizing that society is not a machine. You don't just put pieces together and expect it to work in a certain way. Society is complicated. It is an organism, and therefore you can't just do what you please with it like it's a machine. For that, they need to have that humanities training, a little bit of exposure to it. And humanities kids would also benefit with a little bit of exposure to the real world, as it were, because we also sometimes get lost in our own little disciplines and, splitting hairs into smaller and smaller pieces, trying to find that one dissertation little corner where we can write a fresh thesis on something. That also happens. I think we just need an overall rehaul in how people think and how people are trained to think from a young age.
This is like a science professor telling me, science il jadi illa. Jadi humanities there is no caste in science.
Scientific institutions
Exactly. exactly. So the culpability of our educational institutions and our systems of education come out, and the critical rigor with which we need to approach the question that you approach. Yes.
Manu, I have a question.
I don't see you. Oh, hi.
You talk about history books as if there is a solidity to it, as if there is truth in it, and you don't talk much about the identity of the historian. You talk from your perspective, which is when you talk about history as archives, that is not the way somebody from another class, from another section of the society would talk about it. Aren't you the historian as much an archive, as much an element of history? Why do you just gloss over it as if...
I actually don't. I keep saying
history is diverse. Everybody has a different perspective. It's not as simple as that. Your history, the history that you speak is different. It's yours. that is not the way I would probably speak about it. So I was disturbed by why
No, no,
that
no.
element of Manu or the historian is not
No,
there in
it's
the
just that
story.
we are, in a sense, trained not to bring too much of ourselves into it. What comes
But we
of
do.
ourselves is often subconscious. It isn't necessarily something that comes naturally or objectively. The thing is, of course, it matters who the historian is, because what we choose to study, what themes interest us is all subjective at the end of the day. My work features a lot of women, and I'm pretty convinced it has something to do with me growing up with a bunch of strong women around me across different generations that I was exposed to. Now, that is natural. That much is because of my background that I'm choosing these subjects. But when I tackle those subjects, I'm not necessarily actively bringing my position into that thing. You're trained not to do that, and it still happens, but it's not supposed to happen. That's at least the
But
formal.
it's inevitable. You do it.
It is inevitable. Exactly.
Yeah.
I'm not disagreeing with that. It is inevitable. That's why all historians, no matter how objective we try to be, we are never fully objective. We cannot be. There is always going to be a 5% subjectivity in it, minimum, simply because we are human beings as well. As we said earlier, as human beings talking about the past, we are also bringing our own lens to it. That's true. And at the broader level, there's a book by T.C.A. Raghavan called History Men. You should read that book. It's a very, very, very charming book about Jadunath Sarkar, G.S. Sardesai, and one more gentleman, a Rajput person. He was a prince who was also a historian. And it's remarkable because it tells you about early 20th century historians and just the ego clashes, just the politics among historians, and how that ends up affecting their work. Jadunath Sarkar writes about Shivaji, and all the people in Maharashtra hate it. They say, we as Marathas, only we should be able to write about Shivaji. So there's that. There's biases on whether he relies more on Persian sources or other sources. And sometimes, just normal human beings, historians hate other historians. And therefore, they just don't get along. And that also affects the subjects they study and what they do. So I see what you mean. But yeah, that's just.
So next time you buy his books, Kalyani, pass the Manu part out and read the rest. Exactly. It is
Flattered.
charming.
Thank you.
Good evening, sir.
Where?
So there was a notification from certain organizations that they were gonna remove the Mughal study and Delhi Sultanate study from 12th standard textbooks. So what is your opinion on this thing?
Well, the opinion is the textbooks will become from bad to worse. They will just become horrible. You can't change history ultimately. The Mughals were there. You don't need to like the Mughals, but they were there. I don't need to like the Delhi Sultans, but they were there. I have to deal with that reality, right? So there's no point erasing them constantly. Throughout history, people have always tried to erase things. But then, more often than not, that tends to backfire. I'm not singing my own praises. This whole tribal court historians, they try to erase Setu Lakshmi Bai. She died many decades later. I reappeared somehow on the scene, and I decided to make her the focus of my study. You simply cannot erase things. You try to erase them in India, like people try to erase Jawaharlal Nehru now. It's become very fashionable. But the thing is, people abroad are going to keep studying Jawaharlal Nehru. So you may erase it here, you may wipe it out of kids here, but Nehru will continue to survive, and his story will continue to be told in other parts of the world, simply because you cannot contain Nehru to just one geography. He's someone bigger. Gandhiji similarly, we might turn him into something else, but Gandhiji will continue to be studied elsewhere. It's the same kind of thing. These are just political sort of things that keep happening. It's not the first time it's happened. These things have happened in the past. They've happened from the 50s under all governments. It's just that we therefore need to just look into more places for our sources of history rather than just textbooks.
ഹായ് സർ സോ നമ്മുടെ ടോപ്പിക് എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞാൽ വാട്ട് ഇസ് ഹിസ്റ്ററിയാണ്. സോ ഹിസ്റ്ററി എന്ന് പറയുമ്പോൾ എനിക്ക് തോന്നുന്നു മിക്കവർക്കും ഇവിടെ വരുന്നൊരു ഓർമ്മ, ഹിസ്റ്ററി എന്ന് പറയുന്നത് കേൾക്കുമ്പോൾ തന്നെ നമുക്ക് ഓർമ്മ വരുന്നത് പ്രീ ഇൻഡിപെൻഡൻസ് അല്ലെങ്കിൽ പോസ്റ്റ് ഇൻഡിപെൻഡൻസ് നടന്ന കാര്യങ്ങളോ അല്ലെങ്കിൽ അതുമായിട്ട് റിലേറ്റ് ചെയ്തിട്ടുള്ള കാര്യങ്ങളായിരിക്കും. പക്ഷെ മേ ബി ഒരു 50 years ലേറ്റർ അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ഒരു 3000 ആ ഒരു ഇയർ ടൈമിൽ ഇപ്പോഴത്തെ പ്രസന്റ് ഹിസ്റ്ററി എന്നുള്ള ആ ഒരു ടൈമിൽ കുട്ടികൾ പഠിക്കാൻ പോവാണെങ്കിൽ വാട്ട് ഇറ്റ് വുഡ് ബി?
That's a good question. I mean, it's difficult to answer. Obviously, they'll be looking at our Twitter feeds. 2023 അല്ലെങ്കിൽ 21 പ്രസിഡൻസ് എന്ത് ചെയ്യുന്നു എന്ന് പറയുമ്പോൾ ട്വിറ്ററിൽ പോയിട്ട് ഡൊണാൾഡ് ട്രംപിന്റെ ഫീഡ് നോക്കുകയായിരിക്കും ചിലപ്പം വൺ സോഴ്സ് ഓഫ് ഇൻഫർമേഷൻ. ലോട്ട് ഓഫ് ഇറ്റ് വിൽ again the nature of material may change. നമ്മളിപ്പോൾ ഈ ആർക്കൈവ്സിലൊക്കെ പോയി കുത്തിയിരുന്ന് പഠിക്കുന്ന system might change. A lot of this might be digitized, who knows. It might be available at a click. You pay a certain amount of money, it comes to your screen. You may not even need to travel to archives to actually collect that kind of material. അങ്ങനെ ഒരു വ്യത്യാസം വരാൻ സാധ്യതയുണ്ട്. AI has already come into the picture, so there's also that. What it would look like? Well, the thing is, we don't know where we're headed at the moment, so it's very difficult to predict what it will look like. year 3000 ഇതിനെപ്പറ്റി എന്താണ് പഠിക്കാൻ പോകുന്നത്? I don't think they'll be too bothered. നമ്മളിപ്പം year 1000 നടന്ന അത്രയും വലിയ ഗ്രാനുലർ ഡീറ്റെയിലിൽ പഠിക്കുന്നുണ്ടോ? ഇല്ല. Some broad impulses we are studying, some broad things we are studying. The frank truth is most of us are going to sink into obscurity. This whole world that matters so much to us is going to sink and disappear. Nobody in the future is going to care that much about it. Some things about it they will care. Most things about it they will not care. Just as when we talk about things 3000 years ago, we care about some things, but we don't care about all things. അതുപോലെയാണ്. Most of us are just going to vanish into nothingness. Which is also a humbling kind of.
That's a very
place.
robust, optimistic point of view.
Right here.
Where?
To your left.
Oh.
I'm going to make this quick because I've been told that you're running low on time. I went to Kudramalaga recently and there was a tour guide to explain to us that the floor is made out of this material and this is a fun fact about the architecture. This is a throne somebody sat on and this is a sword. And I thought to myself how lucky I am to have this connection to my history. And then what made me sad immediately after is thinking to myself, how are we going to marvel at the houses of the everyday people that lived at that time? How will I know anything about my ancestors who lived during that time, to whom their houses and the objects within them were precious to them? How much of history is of the everyday person is actually lost, and to what extent can we say that our knowledge about the everyday life of people before our time is actually accurate?
Yeah, we've lost a lot of everyday material. Now again, if you just go to a Grama Pradesham anywhere, even outside of Trivandrum, right? Back in the day, they would have that chakram nu parna oru saanam ille. Vellam, to get vellam into the fields. There was this thing, someone would sit on it and pedal on it. You barely see those now. Not even in museums. I don't know where to find them. I've seen one in my lifetime in the 90s at some point. Now they've all been dismantled, destroyed, and they've disappeared as far as I know. I don't think these things exist. Another thing is also the nature of material that's used. So if you go to even a World Heritage site like Hampi, you will find that the biggest structures you're seeing are temples, palaces, elephant stables, the main buildings like that. Because back in the day, only those buildings, royal buildings, etc., were made of stone and lasting material. A lot of ordinary people's houses were thatched, made of timber, made of perishable material that would disappear very quickly. So one fire, everything is destroyed. One time the city is plundered by somebody, everything is destroyed, and all that remains is the kingly architecture of that place, but not the everyday architecture of the ordinary people. So some of it is just the nature of the material. A lot of it fades very quickly. But yes, some of it is also that, the kingly material is made to survive. Buildings erected by powerful people are made to stand for many, many, many centuries. The Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel statue, that's not been made of wood. That's been made of something that's meant to stand for 1,000 years or whatever it is that they have in mind. But what you and I live, the apartment complexes we live in, those are going to get pulled down in 30 years to be replaced by even bigger apartment complexes. You think of a city like London or New York, these places they had big buildings 100 years ago, but all of those have been wiped out to be replaced by even bigger buildings. Because as you go further down the social ladder, things become more ordinary, as it were, and then there isn't that much value ascribed to it, even in our own lifetimes. Forget a historical value, we ourselves don't necessarily ascribe that much value to it. Look at the number of ancestral homes that have been destroyed by the families themselves and replaced with concrete houses with carporch and first floor toilet and things like that, whereas earlier it would have been some kind of timber structure. My ancestors did that. They haven't preserved anything. So it's just So yeah, we do. For example, so here you go into more creative kind of sources for history. So you, for example, read fiction from back in the day. You're getting even take a novel like Indulekha. Indulekha has lots of things you can analyze about it. But ultimately, it is describing a way in which a matrilineal family at the turn of the late 19th century used to live. An elite matrilineal family, but yet it was a matrilineal household, and what the dynamics inside that household were. So the more stories we tell of our own everyday sort of existence. So, Kerala is the best for us. If you read Harish's work, Meera's work, these are everyday experiences of people, human beings. And 200 years from now, if those sources survive, they will be a window into the experiences that ordinary women had, ordinary peasants had, ordinary people had at that time. It's not non-fiction, it's not written down in an archive, and yet it does convey what that everyday ordinariness in life was. So you will look in a more creative way and sometimes read between the lines in order to understand, because the lines themselves may not necessarily demarcate what you're looking for.
I think we need to conclude. Thank you for your questions.
Thank
But
you.
this
Thank you.
thatched roof here will be dismantled tomorrow. Manu and I were speaking about, where did these thatched things come from? They're going to be dismantled in a couple of days, but the memories of this evening, a mesmerizing evening, and Manu's books, I think, will remain as sources of history, and we'll carry our own historical moments. Thank you so much.
Thank
Great
you.
audience.
Thank you.
Thank you, Manu.
Thanks.